At the risk of this being a spoiler alert, Adam Neely concludes a recent video with the following sentence.
People are best served in music school having that experience of reading music because the system as it exists right now rewards those who do have that ability.
Adam's video weighs in on a controversy that was sparked by a tweet by, and I apologize for the pronunciation, Dr. Annika Socolofsky. Music schools love to deny admission to folks who can't read music. This is an obscene form of gatekeeping. It's the type of thing that, if necessary for coursework, can be easily achieved with a few tutoring sessions and should not prevent anyone from being accepted. Adam's video has made me aware of the controversy that has sprung up as a result of that tweet, and it's caused me to reflect on my own experience as I close in on 5 decades as a professional jazz trumpet player and more than 3 decades teaching jazz in the university setting. My performing career, like Adam's, can be divided into separate categories. On the jazz side, it's been either big bands or small groups. Now, big bands, by default, involve reading. The small groups often involve written music as well, unless we're playing common knowledge standards, although improvising is the most important skill in that situation. On the commercial side, I've worked as a session musician in the recording studios and in the orchestras for Broadway musicals. High-level reading ability is a given for those gigs. Even in a show that runs for years playing the same music, you won't make it through the rehearsal period if you're struggling to read the part. Plus, the path into show work is usually to sub for an established player, and that is an intense challenge because you're expected to read a part and yet fit in with others who've played theirs hundreds or thousands of times. Like Adam, I've played in a lot of cover bands as well, at corporate events and weddings. Now, typically the rhythm section players in those gigs are expected to know the repertoire, but horn players will often have charts, especially if there's a horn section. That might be less the case with a band that has a consistent personnel, but in my experience, these bands usually have a rotating cast of players depending on who's available on a given night. So the bottom line for me, and for anyone that aspires to a similar career path, is that the ability to read music is an essential skill. Now, I was fortunate enough to have individual musical training early on and good school music programs throughout, so by the time I got to university, I was already a pretty good reader. Now, at this stage of my career, I don't play the shows or the cover gigs anymore, and recording sessions are a cause for celebration, so my reading skills are not put to the test on a daily basis like they used to be. Still, I've got to include it in my practice routine to keep the rust at bay. Now, this is my experience, and there are professional situations in which reading ability may not be paramount or needed at all. Adam uses Patrick Bartley as an example, playing on the Stephen Colbert Show where he said he almost never saw a piece of written music. So that brings us to the question of whether university music programs should consider reading ability when assessing applicants. While Adam acknowledges and to a certain degree agrees with the sentiment expressed in the tweet, he brings up some of the pragmatic opposition. For example, the idea that if reading could be taught in a few tutoring sessions, then it wouldn't really be a barrier to admission. And also the fact that knowing the principles of written music and being able to read and perform music in real time are not the same thing. Adam points out that written music is the underpinning of practically the entire system of teaching Western music. Now, I imagine that Dr. Socolofsky and many others would say, well, this is exactly the problem. I titled this video, Don't Play by Eye, because this is something I've said to many students over the years. The idea is that you should rely primarily on the sense that is best suited for the task. For music, that's clearly the oral sense, or the ears. When you read music, you're trying to interpret sound with your eyes. And in doing that, you block some of the input from your ears. You hear music differently and better when you don't have a visual impression of it in front of you. From a listener's perspective, when you perceive that a musician's focus is on a music stand or an iPad, that acts as an impediment to the connection. Adam points out that on what he calls artist gigs, he's expected to play without written music for that very reason. There may have been music to begin with, but to deliver a compelling performance, it's got to be memorized. When what you play resides within, you're better able to interact with what you hear from other musicians, and that's when music reaches higher levels. If a student is learning a piece of written music, say a classical etude, I suggest that they work on it in small chunks, maybe 2 or 4 bars. The first step is to memorize those bars. Now, that's much more doable than trying to memorize an entire page. The real work begins when you can practice it with your eyes closed, because every note then takes on greater significance and you become more aware of the intervallic relationship between the notes. The value of memorizing music is magnified when it comes to learning music by ear. The way I think of it is this: I want to get as much information as I can with my ears before my eyes enter and in some ways cloud the picture. As a jazz musician, if I'm learning a tune, I'm way better off learning it from recordings rather than a lead sheet. Now, it's tempting to use the lead sheet to quickly get to the starting line, and I'm not immune to that temptation, but I sure know the difference between something that I've learned by ear and something that I've learned by eye. Written music in the form of lead sheets still have a role to play because the ears are not infallible. Now, also in terms of learning the correct melody, it's hard to get that from jazz recordings, which are by their nature stylized. One of my favorite sources for learning the melody as it was originally composed is the singer Rosemary Clooney. By learning a song from a singer, you also get the words, which I consider to be an essential part of knowing a song. In the classical tradition, I'm sure it would work exactly the same way if a student had to learn a concerto by ear before they could see it notated. And at that point, they wouldn't need to see it notated. I think they'd have a much greater understanding of how their part fits into the composition as a whole. An orchestral musician needs that contextual understanding just the same as a jazz musician does. In jazz, we have the added layer of improvisation. When you're improvising, there are no notes for you to read. But most of the time, there are chord changes, and the same rule applies. If you're looking at the chord changes, that not only blocks some of the information coming through your ears, it impedes your own creative process as you try to create an aspect of the music on the spot. Now, none of this is an argument against being able to read music. But written music is just a starting point and a way to communicate information. It may not be the best starting point, but it's usually the most expedient. On an individual level, learning music by ear is typically slower, but clearly more beneficial. When you're working with a group, teaching them the music by ear is fantastic, but it can be torturously slow and frustrating for those in the group who may be better or faster at it than others. Adam talks about his time at the Berklee College of Music, working as a tutor for students who arrived at the school with no ability to read music. He describes the experience as a tough one for a 20-year-old student teacher because many or most of his students continued to struggle throughout their time at the school. So much for the idea that a few tutoring sessions will quickly get you up to speed on par with others who've been reading for years. Now, you may think, wait a minute, if reading ability is a barrier to admission, how did those students even get in? Well, in my own experience at Berklee, my roommate in the first year had been playing guitar for a total of 6 months. The range at the school then, and I assume now, went from almost complete beginner, like him, to shockingly advanced classmates. Now, Berklee has a good system for stratifying the students, which in my roommate's case had him playing in a group with 15 other guitarists. Where I teach, in the jazz program at the University of Toronto, we don't require reading as part of the audition process, although the classical program does. It's not because we don't value it as a skill, but because the limited amount of time for an audition means that we have to focus on the specific skill sets and potential as jazz musicians. It's pretty rare that someone demonstrates substantial skill as an improviser without possessing at least the level of reading ability that will allow them to keep up in their courses. So the old joke goes, how do you get a guitar player to turn down? You put music in front of them. It's as true today as it ever was that guitar players on the whole don't read as well as the horn players, because they typically haven't had the experience of playing in concert band or orchestra, and if they play in the jazz band, they're mostly reading chord symbols. Now, that's still true in university, but guitar players do sometimes need to read a written line, so the disparity may show itself. Most of the horn players in our program come out of good high school music programs, and the vocalists often have some choral training, so they tend to have some reading ability. Bassists and drummers are rarely called upon to play a written melodic line, so the lack of that skill may not show itself as readily in performance. Now, that said, I remember one specific drummer who was taking a shot at the vibes, and I realized he was mentally reciting Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge to figure out the notes on the part. Composition and arranging are another matter, but I don't know how you could argue that knowing how to read and write music is not an essential skill for that. Yes, of course, there are exceptions. Joni Mitchell is by any measure a supremely talented and prolific composer, and yet I remember in the liner notes for one of her albums, she thanked Tom Scott for showing her where C is on the guitar. There have been great musicians who don't read music, although I think fewer than there used to be, and one can argue that written music can even be a detriment, but it is one of the ways we communicate. At the university level, we generally expect students to arrive with the fundamental tools and understanding to work with them on a higher level. Absent one of those, we may do them a disservice by placing them in a situation in which they're going to be at a disadvantage. So does that make it right that a university denies admission to an otherwise deserving student because they can't read music? Well, if we take the case of a blind student, that would be a human rights violation. I've had a few blind students over the years, and for that matter, I toured with Ray Charles. It's fair to wonder if hearing becomes more astute when vision is not available, and in that regard, those musicians without sight might even have an advantage. So as a hard and fast rule, reading ability should not by itself be a disqualifying factor, but I do think that it's fair to consider it as part of the overall assessment of musical skills, just the same as ear training or instrumental technique. If a potential student is severely deficient in any of those areas, it's most likely to their advantage to address that before starting university rather than trying to play catch-up. Finally, regardless of what anyone thinks about university music programs, those of us who teach in that setting are trying our best to give students the tools that will help them achieve their musical goals. It's possible to be a great musician without knowing how to read music, but as Adam concludes, there are rewards for those who do have that ability.